We all have things that we're good at. And we all have things that we're not so good at. I'm not very good at the whole gift thing. You know, like, what do you give to someone for your anniversary? Or what do you give to your kids for Christmas or their birthdays? I'm not only not good at it, I'm really bad at it. And I remember sharing this struggle with a friend of mine who happened to be a professor of genetics at South Dakota State. And he said, you know, I think there's a reason, a scientific reason for it. I said, I'm all ears. He goes, what do you know about genetics? What do you know about chromosomes? I said, well, I know that, you know, there's an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. He goes, yeah. He said, in fact, that discovery was made by Reinhold Goddard. Now those Germans. They're smart. My wife's part German, and it pains me to say that. But they're really smart. All of the great theologians of the 20th century, they were all Germans. We ended up being able to get into space because of the German scientists. And so, what do you mean that's the answer to my dilemma? He said, think of it this way. Think of the X chromosome as being the complete chromosome. And then think of the Y chromosome not as a Y, but think of the Y as an X with something missing. He said, so, and I got some people who are going to guard me here. So he said, think of it this way. Now, I'm not telling half of you in this room what you don't already know. Men are women, only less. We're missing something. And he said, I am convinced that on that part that we as males happen to be missing is what I call the it gene. The it gene? Yeah. He said, remember that movie with Michael Keaton and his girlfriend and they're arguing? And she looks at him and she said, you don't get it, do you? And Michael Keaton goes, no, I get it, I get it. What? I happen to be missing that gene. Now that doesn't mean I can't learn. And I have learned over the years, because it was my anniversary just a week and a half ago. I remembered the anniversary in the morning when my wife gave me a nice little kiss on the forehead and said, happy anniversary. And I said, I remembered that. Now I have a brother who's got this spooky gift. He remembers any number. I can call him on the phone and say, you know, when I lived in Southern California in the 70s, what was my phone number? He'll rattle it right off. I'll say, you know, we have, you know, like a great aunt that lived in Canada and never came to the U.S. When was her birthday? He'll rattle it right off. Drives me nuts. Now, there are some birthdays I remember because they coincide with things. Like I have my son, Bo, who was born December 31st. That's an easy one to remember. My daughter, Cass, was born April 22nd. That's Earth Day. That's an easy one to remember. The rest of them a little hazy. There's a bunch of them in December, I remember that. But you can teach an old dog new tricks. You can. And I have learned over the years, through trial and punishment, that there are some things which are not good anniversary gifts. I have learned, for example, through trial and punishment, that if it's not a card or balloons, don't buy it at the dollar store. Don't do it. There's nothing there that's going to work. The second thing I learned was appliances. No. If you can plug it in, no. Because the truth of it is, I buy the appliances from, remember that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus? Yeah. Guys, I'm like Tim the Tool Guy. Guys like tools because they do things. I have tools that can do things that I don't even know what they can do, but I have them. Because it's a tool. So when I'm looking at an appliance, what I'm really looking at is, wow, wouldn't this be great for me? I mean, something that can puree meat and grind barley. What could go wrong there? You know? Don't do appliances. And the third thing I learned in an extremely painful way, don't re-gift funeral flowers. Now, I must confess that I still to this day don't get it. When I was in Arizona, and we were still working on the first 100 years of our marriage, I did a lot of weddings for snowbirds. Not weddings, funerals for snowbirds. Because they would come to Arizona, and then, you know, some of them made back. And they would want a service there. And I would do the services, because they had a hard time finding any pastors who would do them. And I wouldn't do them. Many of these people came from where I had come from. And then afterwards, now it used to be, kind of in the old days, I lived in a funeral home when I was in college, and a big part of what we did following a funeral is we took the flowers and delivered them all over. They don't do that anymore. They tell the family, take what you want, the rest we throw away. Now, help me out here. A flower is a flower, right? I mean, they don't have, the people who grow these, they don't have like one field of flowers, or these are funeral flowers, and one field of flowers. These are anniversary flowers. No, they just have flowers. And so one day I had finished the service, and the guy said to me, take one of these home to your wife. Didn't go well. She took one look at the flowers, and she said, who died? How do you know that? I even tried to get clever. I would take the bouquet of flowers, I would take all of them that looked kind of funerally, I would then rearrange it into a smaller little vase and take them home. No. In fact, one day my wife was sitting with one of her friends as I came home with a bouquet of flowers, and her friend said, who died? So don't do that. Today we have this interesting text about a gift. But it's as much about perspective. It's about perspective. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. Jesus knows what is awaiting him. He knows that. And he stops in Bethany, just a short ways from Jerusalem, to be with his friends, Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And lest we forget, John puts in there Lazarus, the one he raised from the dead. And they have a meal. Now, the meal was unlike meals as we sort of experience them here. These meals would go on for hours. It was a time of community. It was a time of conversation. And it would go on and on. And they're sitting there. And they're engaged in this intimacy of this meal. And all of a sudden, for some reason, Mary gets up and leaves, comes back with a jar of very expensive perfume. And she kneels down in front of Jesus. She pours the entire little flask of nard out onto his feet. She wipes it with her hair. And now comes the perspective. All of the people in that room have experienced the exact same event. And yet their interpretation of it is very different. When Judas looks at this event, what does he immediately think? Money. Money. This should have been sold for 300 denarii. Now that is a lot of money. A denarii is usually what one made in a day to work. So you're looking at basically a year's worth of wages. He says in order to give it to the poor, but John puts in there, lest we don't understand Judas, that no, he was not caring about the poor at all. Judas was a thief. He saw this as money he could put into his own pocket. Jesus sees it from a very different perspective. Jesus says what she is doing is wonderful. She is preparing my body for burial. Was that what Mary was doing? No. Mary, like everyone who followed Jesus, will stay in denial, just as you heard John, will stay in denial right up to the bitter end. They didn't really accept Jesus' words that he was on his way to Jerusalem to die. They believed at the last moment he would pull himself out of that. He would establish his earthly kingdom. We already have encountered James and John who want to be big shots in this earthly kingdom of Christ's. No, they didn't accept for 1 minute that that was going to be the actual outcome. The perspectives. And we've all encountered that. How we can look at exactly the same event. We can hear exactly the same speech. And yet, we hear very differently. I had a friend, and pastors know this, I had a friend who was preaching a sermon one Sunday. He got done, and as usual, they stood at the back, he shook hands with people who walked out. People were walking out, he saw somebody he didn't know. He introduced himself, he said, "And you are?" And he says, "It's my first time here." He said, "But I want to stop for a moment and say thank you thank you. He says, I came here and I was troubled by this whole idea of heaven and hell. And I want to thank you because you've helped me there. The pastor shook his hand, he left. Now the pastor who used the manuscript went back and looked at his, he had never once mentioned either heaven or hell. You see, Jesus saw in this event death because that was on Jesus' mind. Jesus knew in a few short days he would be turned from blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord to crucify him. And so in that event, Jesus saw the preparation for his burial. Judas, who had nothing but money and greed on his mind, when he looked at that event, that's exactly what he saw. Different perspectives. People hear things not from what is being spoken, but from where they are. We've seen this all the time in our world. Someone can give a speech like an inaugural address or a State of the Union speech, and one person who's looking at exactly that speech will say, oh, it's the greatest thing I've ever heard. And another one who heard exactly the same speech will say, it's the worst thing I've ever heard. It's because we come at it with our own background, our own ideas, our own understandings, and we read into that. My funniest account of this was my first parish. There were 3 of us on staff. And at the end of the service, whoever preached would stand in the middle, and us outliers would stand on the outside parts, and we'd shake people's hands as they walked. And then a guy came up to me and he said, I want to thank you for that sermon. It was incredible. I said, well, thank you. I haven't preached. A sense of perspective. But what we lose in this is the gift. What is John telling us? He's telling us about a gift. A gift that will be poured out, not in part, but in total, will be poured out without regard of cost, without condition, without reservation, without obligation. The costly gift poured out for you. For